My friends, a lot's changed in the last year, besides the fact that now I have a mustache, a goatee, and wear glasses like Joey. But besides that, we know one thing that has not changed, and that is the fact that cheap guitars still kind of sound like cheap guitars, and we're always dealing with them and trying to figure out how to make them sound a little bit more expensive. Well, don't you worry, because by the end of this video, I'm going to make sure that I show you all the tips and tricks that I can getting a cheap guitar to sound as expensive as possible. So what's going on, guys? Miami here with JST, and one thing that I want to talk about is the fact that I use cheap guitars, like all the time. Like, you guys probably saw me play this guitar in so many videos. This is a Squire of mine. And the reason that I play it and kind of pimped it out is because I am a lefty. And when you're a lefty and you're running a studio, you don't want to buy a lot of guitars for yourself because no one else can play them except for you. And that's not really helpful when you're tracking. I mean, my Gibson is right-handed, my Fender Strat American is right-handed, my Fender Tele American is right-handed, Dingwall is right-handed, all my guitars except for a couple, like an Epiphone and the Squire. So I always had to find a way of making these sound as good as you could, and we're going to get into that. The first thing that you want to think about whenever you're dealing with a cheap guitar is this: you cannot compromise anymore. Before getting crazy with this, we have to think about one thing, and that's what goes in the tone. There's a lot of factors of stuff that change the way a tone is, regardless of the type of guitar that you have. One, what type of pickups are you using? Another thing, what about the cable length? How long is the cable that you're using? Is it the proper cable for what you're trying to do? Another thing, the type of pick that you're using, and obviously the strength of your left or right hand, left in my case. And of course, is your guitar even set up? So all of these things go into number one. You cannot compromise any further. The fact that you're already using cheap hardware, cheap parts, a guitar that's probably poorly intonated, a guitar that is not going to stay in tune as well as another guitar is, you can't compromise anymore. You're going to want to give it its best fighting chance. And the analogy I'm going to use, is anyone into like racing, street racing? So if you know what a sleeper car is, it's basically a car that just looks like a regular car, but bless me. Yeah, a sleeper car looks like a regular car, but they've swapped out some things. They've done a cold air intake. They've put a new really fast engine into it. So when they pull up racing next to somebody else that has a typical racing car and they're able to keep up, it's like, oh, like how are they able to do that? It's because they're thinking. Now, if they would have not done anything and kept all the stock parts that were there, are they going to be able to keep up? No, they're not. So you want to make sure that your guitar is set up. We do have a video here showing you how to set up guitars, by the way, in case you're interested. It's with Diego Casillas. You want to make sure that you're using a cable that's not too long, because one thing that I tend to notice about guitars that are cheap is that they have a very brittle high end, and the low mids are usually kind of muddy, and you're gonna get a nicer, sheenier presence by having a shorter cable. 6 feet, usually something like that will help out in that situation. You want to make sure you put fresh strings on it. It doesn't matter that you listen to some other band and when they're in the studio they don't change strings all the time, because they're probably using a really nice guitar going into a really nice amp, going into a really nice chain, being mixed by a really awesome engineer. And not to say that you're not an awesome engineer, but so yeah, that's probably not the situation that you're dealing with. So you just want to go off a checklist and make sure that your guitar is set up properly. You want to make sure that the strings are new. You want to make sure that it has pickups that you can at least play with. I've heard some really awful stuff in my day. You want to make sure it's not noisy. This is giving you some chances so that you can fix everything later on. So that leads me to the next thing that you can do. You can EQ the DI signal before it goes into an amplifier. It's all about the source at the end of the day. One thing that I always hear on cheap guitars is the top end of the signal is pretty brittle, the low mids are kind of muffly, and the noise floor is kind of weird. Like, it's pretty noisy on a guitar that has cheap pickups on it. It has something to do with the winding and materials and all that stuff, and it just doesn't cost enough for them to justify fixing those things, I guess. So I'm gonna show you guys an example of how drastic just EQing a signal before it hits an amp can be, because it's going to change the way that the amplifier reacts. Let's check that out. You see how amazing that sounded? And that was just using a little, well, it was a lot of EQ. We used a lot of EQ, but it did exactly what we wanted it to do. And if we were going to take this a step further and go to number 3, I would say to use our plugin DI match. Now, what's different about DI match than EQing before an amp? Well, it is EQing what's happening in the amp, or it's matching to a profile, but it's doing it to a profile of something we already know is good. When you're EQing before an amp, you're kind of just going in the dark and hoping that you come up with something good. But if you were to use DI match and match that to something that already sounds great, a profile from a producer that you already like, you're now working with something that is going to have a way better sonic signature than what you would have done probably just EQing that thing. Let me show you an example of how effective DI match can be when used properly on something that doesn't sound that great. So there you go. Once again, that's going back to the source, and all these little things are adding up to make for a greater thing. We started from the beginning. We started with the cable that we use, plugging it in. Hopefully we got some decent pickups. If not, something like DI match is gonna help us out a little bit. Wanted to make sure we had the right pick, the right strings, the right amplifier also. There's a million things that go into that tone. But that brings me to number 4. If DI match was something you were using and you still didn't know what to do afterwards, because now you just have a good DI signal, you could use our plugin Toneforge Disruptor. And what Toneforge Disruptor does is it has DI match in it, but it also has an entire list of presets, and those presets are based off of the DI profiles that are in there. So imagine if you take a cheap guitar and you match that signal to the signal that a producer was using to make his preset. Because when you typically turn on some kind of plugin and it has presets, those presets are not made for your guitar. They're made for whoever was playing and whoever was mixing. But now, in this scenario, if you have a bad signal, it's going to match it to whatever was intended by the producer when they made the preset in the first place. And one thing I want to talk about, because people are going to be like, oh, you're just trying to push your products. But bro, what else would you do? You could use EQ match, right? You could EQ match, you could use isotope or fab filter. But when you do something like that, you're going to run into this problem. If I'm EQ matching something and I'm palm muting, and the other part isn't palm muting, or let's say my target is being palm muted and then I'm playing octaves, well, it's not going to sound the same because all that low end buildup is going to go into the snapshot. And the thing about DI match is it's not static, it's dynamic. So it's literally picking up the entire range of the guitar, and then it's going to be dynamic as you go along in what's playing. And that's what's different about it, and that's why it makes such a big difference. So you can try and do it other ways though. I tried to show you how I would have did this EQing, tried to say all the things that are going to affect it, tried to help you get there. So let's go over all these things one more time. The first thing, no more compromises. You're already using a cheap guitar, that's as down bad as you can be. Number two, we want to try EQing before we go into the amp. Number three, using something like DI match, because now we know that the signal is following the curve of something else that is known, tried and true to have sounded amazing. And Toneforge Disruptor, because if you want to take it past just getting the DI right and you want the amp to sound great, well, now you have options without having to think. Because not everyone wants to sit there and tweak an amplifier forever. Some of us do. I love doing it, but not everybody wants to do that. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that. If you're an engineer on the come up, give this video a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe. You only have to do it one time, and tap that bell for notification so when a video drops, you know the location. Until next time, my friends, I'll catch you later.